Like Steve did last time, talked about Moses, and he was like, okay, Moses is right up there, just probably next to Jesus. And he was this really cool, amazing dude who did all these amazing things. And yet he had his imperfections, so he was an imperfect hero. So Steve did next to Jesus. I'm kind of doing like more from the bottom of the pyramid in one sense, and I love it because I can't relate so much with Moses as I relate with Rahab. I just relate so much more with Rahab. Uh, we as a group in the home group had discussed last week on this passage, and I must apologize. A lot of what I'm going to say today is going to be related to some of what we talked about, but thankfully all of you were not there, so it's not a repeat for all of you. But this particular passage is not easy to digest for many reasons. Do we agree with that? Can someone talk us through? Do you have some discomfort with this passage, or some difficulties? Could you share what those are if you have it? I mean, if you're all fine with it, then it's no problem. But if you have challenges in trying to understand this passage, what would it be? What are some of the things that you want to think about? And sorry, we didn't actually read the passage where he shared the story. It's in Judges. It's in Joshua 2. Anybody? She was a traitor to her people. All right. Did it ever? All right. Thanks, Denman. Anything else? She lied. Right. Yeah, thanks for sharing, guys. She was a prostitute as well. And I know that we've gone beyond looking down on that. But I think we did struggle, when we were having a chat in our home group. Like, how do we deal with the fact that she actually was a traitor? Wasn't she? Like, imagine, some enemy nation coming and attacking us in India, and then we, giving away secret information to them, and how does that count as a good thing? Right? And then as we discussed at our home group, one interesting article on Rahab had the title, "The Hooker and Her Lies That Pleased God." Right? And we discovered in our home group that we are not able to swipe Rahab under the carpet after the story, right? Because like Ben reminded us, she comes again in the Bible, again and again and again, like 3 times. In fact, Rahab is mentioned in a lot more places in completely different contexts. She appears in Psalms, but it's more referring to a particular geography rather than a person. I discovered that the word Rahab comes something like 14 times in the Bible. And when Steve spoke to us about Moses, do you remember what he said was faith for Moses? I wrote that down because it resonated so strongly with what I was going to talk about. What was faith for Moses? Can anyone this is not a test. I mean, you don't have to worry if you don't remember it. But in case you do you remember? Do you want to share what you think was faith for Moses in that particular burning bush situation? Faith for Moses was responding to the mission. Saying yes. because that was a hard thing for him, right? You remember? It's inexplicable as to why that was hard, given his history. But of course, Steve explained how over the entire period of 40 years, he would have just lost all of that. And then when God says, now go, I have this thing that you need to do. What was faith? Faith was saying yes to that mission. What was faith? For Rahab, right? You know, often Hebrews 11, which is a passage, one verse that was read today, is called the passage of the heroes of the faith. So is it heroes of the faith or is it heroes of faith? And why am I making that distinction? You know, a lot of times we say heroes of the faith, or like heroes of India, or heroes of Christianity, marked by all the cool things they did, right? All the exploits. That's why we talk about, that's the usual context in which we talk about heroes. But if you actually read carefully the names in Hebrews, they are not heroes of the faith as such. They are not they are definitely people that we look up to, and we want to be like them, but not because they did great exploits, even though some of that was. But what were the things that were actually spoken about in that passage? Was they were heroes in teaching us how to believe. Not so much in what they did, because although as we keep going forward today, we're going to discover in many ways that's one and the same thing. Yeah. But they were heroes of faith. You read about them and then you say, wow, they really believed, these people. They really believed. And it talks about many of them. It says that many of them didn't even receive what they believed in, including Moses. We talked about Moses last time. God said, you're going to lead all these people out into the promised land. And guess what? He never saw it. I mean, he did see it, but he wasn't in there. And yet he believed. He had believed all this time. But you know, a lot of times, if you notice, much of this demonstration of faith that they had was very linked to their context, their specific context. A lot of us are not going to do any of the things they did. You know, like when we talk about being heroes, you say, I want to be like that, but you won't do many of the things they did. What was it said about Noah in Hebrews 11? Sorry, I'm going to Hebrews 11 here, even though we didn't read it, but we had that one passage from Rahab. But I'll just spell it out for you. If you have it in front of you, you'll see Noah's faith was building an ark. Anyone here going to build an ark anytime soon? Abraham's faith was going where he did not know where he was supposed to, where he was going. Some of us might have to do that. There's a possibility there. But child sacrifice, no, I don't think so. Child sacrifice. The next one. Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac. Yeah. And then there's Jacob, there's Joseph, and then we heard about Moses. It actually mentions Jacob's act of faith was leaning on his staff and worshiping God. Joseph's act of faith was asking the people to keep the remains of his body so that when they go back to Israel, they will take it with them. That's literally what it says in Hebrews 11. These are the acts of faith that we are looking at. You know, and so I just wanted to bring home a few things about what it means to have faith. And we're going to go back to that James passage, which actually says there is no difference between faith and action. Did you notice that all these things that I spoke about with all these gentlemen and ladies had to do with actions? All of these were actions, right? But these were actions that demonstrated faith. You know, there's this whole argument, right, among Christendom about what is it that saves us? Is it our works or is it our faith? And it's uncomfortable almost that James, this James, when he read a passage on James, his version said works. Right? But I just wanted to bring home a few things today, and the first one, I think we've already made a point, is that faith is demonstrated by action. You know, one of the things Steve also reminded us last time was our belief, our faith is not merely, or it's actually not at all intellectual. It might start intellectually. It might be about agreeing to a certain set of data, right? But that's not it. You can agree, but then you have to follow it up with an act. And this is, this is, there was some conversation about Martin Luther and how he didn't want the book of James in the Bible because it says all this stuff that doesn't line up with everything else that Paul seems to be saying. He's saying it's you are not saved by works, you're saved by faith through grace. And so do you feel the tension there? Do you feel that there's something here that I need to wrap my head around, I need to get my hands around to try and understand? One of the things I realized that James was saying, and if you read the book of James, you will notice that he's not making a case for works. He's making a case for integrity. He's not saying you're going to be saved by these works. If you read those passages, there are multiple instances that he talks about. He says, do you believe that the poor are important and should be cared for? All right, then how come you treat them so badly when they come to church? He's making a case for integrity. And if you realize, when we read the entire Bible, it is a case for faith demonstrated by works. What would happen if you recommended a doctor to somebody for something that you or yourself struggle with, let's say, and then you yourself go somewhere else? How would it look to the person to whom you recommended that person, or you recommended that doctor? How would it feel like if you said, hey man, have you been to that restaurant? So-and-so dish there is the best ever. I'm not saying every time you go there, you should order that particular dish, but maybe a little bit more often than normal, you would. But how would it feel like if you never ordered that dish after recommending it to somebody else? It's inconsistent, right? It's inconsistent. Charles Blondin, this is the guy I was talking about on Friday, but I forgot his name. This is this famous guy in 1859. He was famous, why? Because he would take a wheelbarrow on a tightrope across the Niagara Falls. So he walked 150 feet above the falls, 160 or 150 feet, and several times back and forth between Canada and and the US, because that's what I believe that, so huge crowds would look with shock and awe at everything that he did. So once he crossed in a sack, once on stilts, another time on a bicycle, and once he even carried a stove and cooked an omelette. And so on July 15th, Blondin walked backwards across the tightrope to Canada. And he returned pushing a wheelbarrow. And then it is said he asked his audience, "Do you believe that I can carry a person across in this wheelbarrow?" And of course, they had seen all of that stuff that he said. Of course, the crowd said yes, and they believed. And then Blondin posed the question, so who will get in the wheelbarrow? Of course, no one did. And that is what James is really saying. He's basically saying, if you believe that God can take you across the Niagara Falls on a tightrope, then jump into the wheelbarrow. Otherwise, your faith is dead. Sorry, James said that, so I can say, I don't have the guts to say something like that. But James said that. So the first thing, faith is accompanied with action. There is no such thing as faith without action. But I want to make a distinction between good works and faith a little bit. And that's why the story of Rahab really helps. And this is the point I want to make. We bring the faith. God makes us holy. We bring the faith, but God makes us holy. And it's not always that these things happen together. A lot of times we meet, I meet, and I'm sure a lot of us meet people who seem to be doing all the wrong quote unquote things. They don't align with some of the principles that we might hold on to, even principles that are biblical. But they come with so much faith. They truly believe in Jesus. They truly believe in what he did. And I want to say that faith is valuable, and that faith will bring holiness eventually as God transforms them. And so that faith that comes out of holiness, I want to make a slight distinction between that and the faith that is and the action that demonstrates demonstrates the faith. A lot of times, and to understand that, we just simply go back to all the examples I just mentioned. Building an ark is not an act of holiness. Putting a scarlet robe out of the window is not an act of holiness on its own. There's nothing nothing that shows great character about that, except that it showed faith. Wanting to sacrifice your son is actually a terrible thing to do. Please don't do it. But in that particular case, it demonstrated faith. Right? And those were not acts of character or holiness. But one of the things that's always true is that it is high stakes. Those are high stakes decisions of some sort. Did you know how long Noah was building the ark for? Does anyone know that? 150 years. 150 years of a jeering crowd every day talking to him and saying, "Man, dude, this old man's gone nuts." I mean, I know it's difficult to fathom. We don't even live that long. But he was building that ark for. It was high stakes. Can you imagine how much effort it would take to build an ark that can carry every single species on earth? A high-stakes decision sometimes is what demonstrates faith. Because if your faith doesn't have a cost, or it doesn't have an outcome, or it's not a gamble of some sort, again, it's not faith, is it? Because if you didn't choose something over something else, like Noah could have chosen to just not build the ark and retain his status in society and live a normal life. A lot of us would have chosen to do that. What about Rahab? You're talking about her. You know, one of the things that we were talking about was, even much as it seems obvious that Jericho was going to lose that war, it wasn't really as obvious as that. There was fear, but Jericho was a fortified city. And fortified cities were usually not beaten in wars. What was it going to take for that city to be defeated? We all know what it was. What was it going to take for that city to be defeated? The walls had to fall down. Do you think that in those, I mean, I'm pretty sure they would have had implements, but do you think the Israelite army was carrying battering rams and catapults and stuff like that, which had the ability to bring down fortified city walls? I doubt it. But what did Rahab know? Rahab knew what God had done before. What was she staking on this decision? What was she staking on this decision? She was staking her own social standing, which anyway was way down there because she was a prostitute and probably looked down upon and had a terrible life. And there she was, ready to let even that little hint of respectability go away. What was it that she was taking it on? She was taking it on a story that she had heard about Yahweh and what He did with Israel. And she took a call. She took a call. Faith is always about taking a call. And this was a messy call. Because like we said, it involved treason and it involved lying. But what did we say? We bring the faith. God brings the holiness. Eventually, we know that Rahab married Salmon, and Salmon was the father of Boaz. They were both parents of Boaz. And Boaz was an amazing person. How does that happen? Probably had something to do with the parents. So like we said, I don't think many of us might be required to build an ark or tie a scarlet robe outside your wall to demonstrate your trust in Jesus. It's possible that some of us might have to take a call like choosing between Jesus and our families. And I know that there are some of us here who've done that. Sometimes it's as difficult as that. But for some of us, for most of us, it's still not going to be as dramatic as that. But you know, one of the things that is common to all of us when we believe in what Jesus did, there are two ways of doing that, right? One is the whole salvation piece that Rahab experienced. She said, I can be saved. This God can save me. But the other is this whole part of the resurrection. You know, we talk about Jesus' death and we talk about His resurrection. And a lot of scripture talks about how that resurrection will make us like Jesus. And all of this, you know, it's probably a little easier to say, okay, I'm a sinner and I need salvation. How many of us actually want to be like Jesus? And wanting to be like Jesus comes out of faith, because God said, be holy like I am holy, just like I am holy. And the question is, why would we want to respond to that? Because of fear of retribution? That if I don't do it, I'll be punished? Is that why we do it? And isn't it true that a lot of us probably have that approach? That holiness is something that I must pursue as a Christian because it's something that I should do. And if I don't do it, I will have to face consequences. But you know what a faith position to me would mean? A faith position to me would mean, if God is asking me to do it, it's got to be the best thing ever. If God is asking me to be holy like Him, it's got to be the best thing ever. That's the faith position. And it changes the entire attitude with which our actions happen. We have to be really, it would be truly sad if we live our entire Christian lives thinking that I need to do X, Y, Z just because God asked me to do it, and man, it's a drag, it's a pain, and I better do it. Loving your enemies, no man, I can't do it, but God asked me, so I'll try. I know there's a bit of that, it is true. But at the back of it, do we have this in our mind? That's the best thing ever, because God asked me to do it? That's the faith position, isn't it? Because that's believing. I don't see it. I can't see it, but I can believe it. Right? And to me, I feel that our life is marked with these calls, these little choices on a day-to-day basis that we make because we believe. And those choices demonstrate that belief, not fear, but the belief in what God has called me to be. When we were singing that song, and I love that song, it talks about, let your glory shine around. It talks about, I fall face down because your glory is shining in this place. And I'm thinking of Jesus, right? That's the glory. It's His glory that we are talking about. How does that make us feel? How does it make us feel when He says that I'm going to want to share some of this holiness with you? Because all of this that you admire about me, I want you to have all of it. I want you to be just like that. But do we believe that it's worth having? Yeah. Those are some of the questions. And if we believe that it's worth having, we would make choices on a day-to-day basis. And God, through His Holy Spirit, will transform us as we make those choices on a daily basis. And it's faith that drives it, right? So we bring the faith. God makes us holy. Rahab brought the faith. It was messy. God made her holy as she became part of His community. And the third thing, obedience to God, is a faith action. Obedience, right? We talked about obedience. We talked about just wanting to become like Jesus. We talked about following His commands. It's a faith action because we choose God over idols, right? Which is something that Rahab did in her very, in her case, it was very literal. In our case, it's the idols in our hearts. Because like we were saying, obeying God for fear of punishment is a really terrible way to live the Christian life. And worse still, it actually does not demonstrate faith, even though it is true. Yes, there is consequences. The Bible talks about it. But that is not our motivator, right? We don't want to obey God because we don't want to land up in a fish, like, Ben spoke about a few days back. That's not our motivation. Our motivation is we believe His commands to be good. And therefore, we trust our lives to Him. And so these faith actions are sometimes inconvenient and sometimes seem foolish, like we said, Noah. Whereas good works on their own, if all of them were good works, I hope you're getting the nuance here. I'm making the distinction now between good works and faith. Good works on their own can give you good brownie points. And then that God says, and the Bible says, is filthy rags on its own. But good works, as an outcome of faith, empowers God to bring that holiness. So Rahab could have probably handed over the spies and become a national heroine, right? Because the king said, I know that these people are there. There are spies. If I was Rahab, I would be craving for some attention in that community, which was not the wrong kind of attention. Yeah. I would have wanted everyone to celebrate me because, I did this great thing for this community. She chooses to do something that will reduce her already non-existent acceptability instead. Imagine what would have happened if Jericho had defended themselves and had beaten Israel, because that was a real possibility, right? We are constantly lured away from a place of loving and trusting God to a place of loving and trusting in other things. That's a battle that we fight every day. And loving and trusting God might feel foolish, like it was in Rahab's case. Although the narratives and everything we hear make it sound like it was a no-brainer decision. It wasn't really. Yeah. But when we trust other things over Jesus, that is idolatry, right? The true loves of our heart. What is the true love of my heart? If my spiritual journey is not constantly laced with the recognition of the true loves of my heart and replacing those loves which are not Jesus to loves which represent love for Jesus, that's my spiritual journey, which I take in faith. I say these are things that I have believed in, but that's not God. That's not the God I should be loving. That's not what Jesus asked me to love. He asked me to love Him. So, a few questions for us. How do we respond when obedience to God feels unsafe or unwise? How do we respond? And when was the last time you had to make a choice like that? Some of us, sometimes it could be, I was just trying to imagine what those could be. There's a whole bunch of painting and electrical work going on in our house. And I'm supposed to prepare for this sermon, which I was like nowhere close to completing that. And I was at home, and there was this electrician, on his own, a young fellow, just graduated something, and he was doing a whole bunch of electrical work, and he was struggling. I could see he was, struggling with a few things. And I had to take a call. to get away from whatever preparation I was doing to just, hold some plaster of Paris stuff for him. I mean, that's what I did for like 2 hours yesterday night. And it's a really silly thing, really, honestly. It's not all that great. But all I'm trying to say is that there are these small choices that sometimes we make out of faith. I had to believe that this was more important. Because what's going to happen? At the worst, I'm going to preach a bad sermon here, and you're going to, nobody's going to beat me up. I'm going to be fine. But that was, at that time, felt more important. And there are these choices that we make. There are also major life choices, of course, that we make. And I know that a lot of you are in that place of having to make choices in life. And I know of stories right here in this room where some of you made like really downright foolish choices. What are you doing here in India, Steve? Away from your family. And many more stories like that in this room. Those choices demonstrate faith. And God uses that. And these choices are with us every day in the big and small decisions. So every time you're making a decision, this is not intellectual, right, like we were reminded. Every time you're making a decision, ask yourself, is this coming from a place where I love Jesus? Or is this coming from a place where I love something other than Him, which is not Him? How many chances, and this I want to end with this question for us. How many chances does God have as a routine to prove His goodness and faithfulness to you? Let me repeat that. How many chances as a routine does God have in your life to prove His goodness and faithfulness to you? Or have you got it all sorted? Because one thing I can tell you, that if we are living a Christian life, it's not safe. And a lot of times when God asks us to do something, it's not safe. But it is good. It's always good. But how many times does God get to show you that it is good? I want to end with this passage in Joshua chapter 5. I don't know if you have it, it'll be super awesome. Joshua 5:13-15. This is just in between this whole incident of Rahab meeting the spies and before they go and do this awfully silly thing of going around and playing music around the walls of Jericho. I told you, God makes you do stuff which is stupid. But here's what happened. Joshua was near Jericho and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" And see the paradigm. And this is a paradigm that we live in, right? Us versus them. Are you for us or for our enemies? Neither. Shocking. Like, I thought we were the chosen race of God and all of that stuff. But what did God say? Neither. But as a commander of the Lord's army, I have now come. You know what he's really saying? Joshua fell down. What is really saying? It's not about whose side I am on. It's about whose side are you on? Whose side are you on? And then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence. Did you know this passage was going to come when you chose that song? And asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. And Joshua did so. So shall we bow our heads just for a minute and in our minds take off our sandals. And as we ponder the decisions in our life, some of which are upon us, do we have the courage to choose God's side?